The letter was written in my own handwriting, but I had never written those words. Marigold Thorne Sinclair's voice cracked as she stared at impossible ink on ancient paper at 11:47 p.m. Every detail about her life laid bare by someone claiming to be her 80-year-old self, someone who knew she stood in her Portland penthouse, wearing a navy blazer with a coffee stain on the left sleeve, reading a prediction that would either save David's life or prove she'd finally lost her mind under the crushing weight of architectural deadlines. The letter trembled in her hands, like evidence of a crime she couldn't remember committing. "You're reading this exactly when you need to," it continued in her precise handwriting. October 15th, 11:47 p.m., after 17 unread messages about the Morrison project. The coffee stain happened during slide 14 when Marcus Chen started checking his phone instead of listening to your sustainable design innovations. Every detail was surgically accurate. The stain was there. Slide 14 had been the exact moment she'd realized her billion-dollar environmental vision meant less to her client than his Instagram notifications. But the letter's next words stopped her heart entirely. "In exactly 43 minutes, you'll receive a call that changes everything. David will be in the hospital. Heart attack at age 45 brought on by the stress of trying to save his failing firm while processing the grief of losing you, not to death, but to ambition. You have one chance to choose differently. This letter is your only warning." Marigold dropped her phone, breath coming in sharp gasps. David's struggling firm, his recent weight loss, the exhaustion she'd glimpsed during their last awkward coffee meeting, the mathematical precision of the prediction terrified her more than its content. Her 80-year-old self had provided a testable hypothesis, verifiable in less than an hour. The stakes crystallized with brutal clarity. If the prediction proved true, everything else in the letter demanded immediate attention. If false, she'd continue her trajectory toward architectural immortality. But if true, the letter continued. David's chest pains started during his 3 p.m. meeting with bankruptcy lawyers. He's been sitting in his car outside Providence Medical Center for 2 hours, afraid to go inside because he has no emergency contact to list. His business partner abandoned the firm last month. His parents live across the country. His sister stopped returning calls after your divorce because she blames him for not fighting harder to save the marriage. The details felt like surgical incisions. She remembered David's business partner leaving, the financial pressures he'd mentioned during their coffee meeting while she checked emails, only half listening as he described losing everything they'd once dreamed of building together. The cardiac event isn't random, the letter continued. It's the physical manifestation of a man carrying the weight of a failing business, a dissolved marriage, and recognizing he's lost the only person who ever understood his architectural vision. His chest pains started 3 months ago. He's been too proud to mention them, too isolated to seek help. Her hands shook as she read about David's father dying of a heart attack at 47. David working 18-hour days for 8 months, sleeping in his office, surviving on coffee and takeout. The signs were always there. You were too busy. Building your empire to notice the man you promised to grow old with was quietly dying of loneliness. Her phone rang exactly 17 minutes early. Marigold? Eleanor Blackstone's voice carried urgent concern that cut through the carefully modulated tone she'd maintained during the day's retreat sessions. "I know this is late, but something extraordinary happened after you left the retreat today. Something that changes everything we think we understand about consciousness and wisdom." Eleanor had facilitated the mountain retreat where Marigold found the letter, a corporate leadership workshop she'd attended only because her business manager threatened intervention about her work-life balance. She'd expected motivational speaking. Instead, she'd discovered an envelope addressed in her own handwriting. "What kind of extraordinary?" Marigold whispered. "After you left, I found a second letter in your cabin, addressed to me in handwriting I didn't recognize but somehow felt familiar. It contained specific instructions for this phone call, including exactly what to tell you, when to call, and how to respond to every question you might ask." The world tilted sideways. Marigold gripped her kitchen counter, Italian marble that felt completely cold to the touch. What did it say? It said the prediction about David is real, that you have 26 minutes to choose between building monuments to your ego and building a life worthy of the love you've been too busy to notice. And it told me to ask you this exact question. What if the letter isn't from the future, but from the version of yourself that already exists in a timeline where someone chose love over productivity, connection over achievement, presence over prestige? Marigold's legs gave out. She slid down her kitchen wall, designer heels clicking against marble tile that echoed in the cavernous space she'd designed for maximum visual impact and minimum emotional warmth. Eleanor, this isn't possible. People don't receive letters from alternate versions of themselves. Time doesn't work that way. Possible is a limitation we place on experiences that challenge our understanding of reality, Eleanor replied with gentle authority. I've witnessed transformations that would be considered miraculous if they weren't so consistent. What matters isn't the mechanism, it's the message. Are you willing to act as if it's real long enough to save a life? The question hung in her sterile apartment like a bridge between two different versions of her existence. Through floor-to-ceiling windows, Portland's lights glittered like a circuit board, beautiful, functional, utterly without warmth. Tell me exactly what the letter said about David. Eleanor's voice grew urgent, abandoning the measured cadence of professional facilitation. It said his heart attack isn't just business stress. It's about loving someone who became unreachable, watching the woman he married disappear behind deadlines and client demands. The letter was specific. If you call him right now and say these exact words, I'm scared I've built a perfect life that's perfectly empty, and I need help remembering how to be human. Something shifts in his nervous system. The stress that would trigger his cardiac event becomes the catalyst for a conversation that redirects both of your lives. Marigold's phone showed 12:24 a.m., 6 minutes until the predicted crisis, according to her mysterious future self's precise timeline. She dialed David's number with trembling fingers, each digit feeling like a choice between the life she'd built and the life she might still be able to live. Marigold, is everything okay? His voice carried the careful concern of someone who'd learned to expect midnight crisis calls from his workaholic ex-wife. It's past midnight. Did something happen with the Morrison project? Even now, even during what might be a life-or-death moment, his first assumption was that she was calling about work. The realization hit her like architectural collapse. Complete. Structural failure of everything she'd thought was solid. I'm scared I've built a perfect life that's perfectly empty, and I need help remembering how to be human. The words tumbled out exactly as Eleanor had instructed, feeling both foreign and completely true, like speaking a language she'd forgotten she knew. Silence stretched between them like a held breath. In the background, she could hear ambient sounds that didn't match his apartment. The distant hum of traffic, the occasional PA announcement, the antiseptic acoustics of institutional spaces. Jesus, Marigold. I was just sitting in my car outside the emergency room, David finally said, his voice breaking with vulnerability she hadn't heard since their marriage counseling sessions 3 years ago. I've been having chest pains for 3 hours, but I was afraid to go in because if something's really wrong, there's no one to call. My business is failing, my marriage failed, and I realized tonight that I don't have a single person in my life who would notice if I just disappeared. The prediction had been accurate to the minute. Marigold's blood turned to ice water as she processed the implications. Either she was experiencing the most elaborate breakdown in recorded history, or something genuinely impossible was intervening in their lives. David, listen to me very carefully. Go inside right now. Get checked out. I'm coming to get you. You don't need to... Yes, I do. For the first time in 2 years, I need to do something that matters more than a project deadline. Don't make me... Explain to your cardiologist why I prioritized sustainable concrete specifications over the man who used to draw building plans on napkins with me when we thought we could change the world. The emergency room at Providence Medical Center felt like a movie set designed for crisis but not comfort. David sat in a corner chair, still wearing wrinkled work clothes that looked like he'd slept in them, looking smaller than she remembered. When he saw her approaching through the automatic doors, something in his face shifted from surprise to relief to something that might have been hope, an expression she recognized from their early dating years when her unexpected arrival could still transform his entire day. Stress-induced cardiac episode, he said as she sat in the adjacent plastic chair. Not a full heart attack, but the doctor said if I'd waited another hour for treatment, the damage could have been permanent. Apparently, my blood pressure has been dangerously elevated for months. Marigold pulled out the letter, its pages now slightly crumpled from her tight grip. I need to show you something impossible. For the next hour, as they waited for David's additional test results, she read him every word. David listened without interruption, his expression cycling through disbelief, wonder, scientific curiosity, and finally recognition, as if the impossible was somehow the most reasonable explanation for the evening's supernatural convergence of events. There's something else, he said when she finished reading. 3 days ago, I found something in my old drafting table, the one from architecture school that I'd moved to my office storage room. A complete business plan written in my handwriting for a firm specializing in affordable housing and community development. Detailed financial projections, design philosophies, even preliminary sketches for modular housing systems that could be manufactured sustainably and deployed rapidly for displaced populations. He pulled out his phone and showed her photos of the documents. The handwriting was unmistakably his, but the content described ideas he'd never consciously developed with such specificity. I don't remember writing any of it, but every detail matches ideas I've been thinking about since graduate school, solutions I never imagined I was capable of developing. The business model addresses problems that kept me awake at night, but with answers that felt impossible until I saw them written in my own hand. They stared at each other across the waiting room, two architects who'd spent their careers designing spaces for other people's lives while systematically neglecting their own, now confronted with evidence that their future selves were apparently more invested in their happiness than their current selves had ever been. What if, David said slowly, his voice carrying the tentative excitement of someone testing a revolutionary hypothesis, what if our future selves are trying to prevent us from building the wrong life? What if this isn't about romance or getting back together, but about learning to build lives that are actually worth living separately or together? Over the following weeks, they began what felt like the most important experiment of their lives. They started writing letters to themselves from progressively older versions, not as formal methodology, but as desperate attempt to access wisdom that their current perspective seemed incapable of providing. The insights that emerged were devastatingly accurate. Marigold's imagined 55-year-old self wrote with surgical precision, "The Morrison Project becomes your template for community-focused architecture, but only after it fails spectacularly the first time. The board rejects your initial proposal because you're still designing for architectural magazines instead of human beings. You've created another monument to your own vision instead of a space where people can build their lives. The failure forces you to completely reimagine what sustainable architecture actually means." The prediction proved accurate with uncomfortable precision. 3 weeks later, the Morrison board rejected her design unanimously. "This is beautiful architecture," the board chair, Maria Santos, said during the presentation that Marigold had assumed would be a formality. "Your technical innovations are impressive, your environmental impact projections are exceptional, and your aesthetic vision is undeniably striking. But this isn't community architecture. You've designed a building that will photograph beautifully for magazines, but won't serve the people who need to work and live around it." Santos continued with feedback that felt like a professional autopsy. "Your community spaces are positioned for visual impact rather than actual use. Your retail configurations prioritize architectural drama over business functionality. Your residential units maximize square footage efficiency, but minimize the flexibility that families need to adapt spaces to their changing circumstances. You've created a monument to your own design philosophy instead of a foundation for community growth." The rejection devastated her professionally but liberated her personally. For the first time in 20 years, she'd failed publicly at something that mattered, and the world hadn't ended. The experience felt like emotional chemotherapy, painful but necessary for growth that couldn't happen any other way. David faced a different kind of crisis. His 60-year-old self had warned about the temptation to rush into social impact work without understanding the communities he wanted to serve. But instead of housing project failure, he discovered something worse. His architectural skills were completely inadequate for the problems he wanted to solve. "I spent 15 years designing luxury spaces," he confided to Marigold during one of their weekly coffee meetings that had replaced their formal strategy sessions. "I know how to create beautiful buildings for people who can afford beautiful buildings." But affordable housing isn't just expensive housing made cheaper. It's an entirely different discipline that requires understanding trauma, family dynamics, community building, and social services. "I'm basically starting over as a student." The Gistu revelation forced him to spend 6 months volunteering at homeless shelters, attending community meetings, and learning from social workers before designing a single structure. The process was humbling and transformative, teaching him that sustainable architecture meant supporting sustainable communities, not just sustainable buildings. But their most profound breakthrough came during month 4 of their correspondence. Experiment, when both received letters that challenged everything they thought they understood about the mysterious guidance that had initiated their transformation. Marigold's 80-year-old self wrote, "Darling girl, there's something I haven't told you about the origins of these letters. They're real, but not in the way you think." Eleanor Blackstone has been using this method for decades, planting future self letters for retreat participants based on psychological profiles, behavioral patterns, and years of observing how people change when they give themselves permission to access their own wisdom. The insights are genuine, but the mechanism is theater. The question is, does knowing this diminish the transformation or deepen it? David received a similar revelation. The business plan you found wasn't written by your future self. It was written by your past self during a period of depression 3 years ago when you were questioning everything about your career direction. You were sketching ideas for a different kind of practice, imagining what you'd build if profit wasn't the primary constraint. You buried the plans because they felt too risky, too idealistic. Eleanor encouraged you to find them again. The dreams were always yours. You just needed permission to remember them. The revelations hit like architectural earthquakes, shaking the foundation of everything they'd built their transformation on. They confronted Eleanor during their next monthly workshop session at the Mountain Retreat Center. "Is it true?" Marigold demanded as soon as Eleanor opened the door to her office. "Did you plant the letters?" Eleanor, now 72 and moving with the careful grace of someone who'd spent decades helping people navigate life transitions, nodded without defensiveness. "I've been using variations of this method for decades. I write future self letters based on psychological assessments, behavioral patterns, and deep listening to what people reveal about their true desires during intake conversations and initial sessions." So the letters were fake. David's voice carried betrayal and confusion, the tone of someone discovering that a miracle was actually an elaborate magic trick. "The letters were theater," Eleanor replied gently, settling into her chair with the patience of someone who'd had this conversation many times before. "But the wisdom they contained was completely real. It was your own wisdom, reflected back to you in a format you were finally ready to accept. Most people already know what they need to change about their lives. They just need permission to act on that knowledge, and sometimes that permission needs to come from a source they trust more than their current judgment." "But the predictions," Marigold protested, feeling like a detective whose airtight case was dissolving in front of her. "The timing, the specific details about David's health, the business failures, were based on patterns I've observed in thousands of clients over 4 decades, Eleanor explained, with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing established science. David's health crisis was predictable based on his stress levels, work habits, family medical history, and the social isolation that typically accompanies business failure. Your professional rigidity was heading toward a breakdown that any experienced coach could forecast. I simply created a framework that would motivate immediate action instead of gradual realization that might come too late to prevent real damage." The room fell silent as the implications sank in like water through carefully constructed defenses. "The question," Eleanor continued, "is whether learning this changes the value of your transformation. Are the improvements in your lives less meaningful because they were catalyzed by therapeutic intervention rather than supernatural guidance? Does the mechanism matter more than the outcome? Marigold and David looked at each other across the workshop space, processing the revelation that their miraculous transformation had been carefully orchestrated by human wisdom rather than temporal magic. "I think," David said slowly, "it makes it more meaningful, not less. Our future selves weren't sending us messages from some mystical timeline. They were always inside us, waiting for permission to speak. Eleanor just created a delivery system we were willing to accept." Marigold nodded, understanding flooding through her like sunrise after a long night. "The letters worked because they gave us permission to access wisdom we already possessed, but were afraid to trust. You created a method for believing in ourselves by pretending the guidance came from someone else." "Exactly," Eleanor smiled with the satisfaction of a teacher watching students grasp a complex concept. "The Future Self Protocol isn't about predicting the future. It's about accessing the part of yourself that already knows what your life looks like when it's being lived, instead of just managed." This revelation transformed their work with what became the Future Self Institute. Instead of marketing it as a mystical experience, they repositioned it as wisdom architecture, a systematic method for accessing internal guidance through structured imagination and temporal perspective shifting. The reframed approach proved even more powerful than the original mystical version. Corporate clients appreciated the psychological rigor and evidence-based methodology. Individual participants found the method more sustainable because it didn't depend on believing in impossible phenomena. It worked by helping people trust their own judgment. Within 2 years, they'd trained facilitators in 6 countries, developed online courses that served hundreds of participants, and attracted attention from research institutions studying the neuroscience of temporal projection and decision-making. Their methodology was featured as the leadership tool that accesses wisdom you already have. Several organizations adopted their community development framework for housing projects, but success brought unexpected challenges that tested everything they'd learned about sustainable living. The Institute's growth demanded exactly the kind of productivity-focused management that had originally driven them to burnout. Marigold found herself working 60-hour weeks again, this time to build an organization dedicated to helping people avoid 60-hour work weeks. The irony became unbearable during their 3rd year, when Marigold collapsed from exhaustion during a presentation about sustainable work-life integration to a Fortune 500 company in Seattle. She woke up in the same emergency room where she'd met David during his cardiac crisis, with David sitting beside her bed, wearing the same expression of concern and frustration she remembered from their marriage. "We've done it again," he said, quietly, his voice carrying the weight of recognition and disappointment. "We've turned wisdom into productivity, transformation into a business model. We're building an empire around the very thing that was supposed to save us from empire building." The collapse forced them to completely restructure their approach. They limited the Institute to serving 50 clients per year, implemented wisdom sabbaticals, mandatory 3-month breaks from all business activities, and relocated from Portland to a small coastal town where the pace of life naturally resisted optimization. Most radically, they began offering the Future Self Protocol completely free, supported by speaking fees and consulting work with organizations rather than individuals. The decision cut their revenue by 70%, but restored their sense of purpose entirely. 5 years after the first letter, Marigold stood in the Morrison Community Center's rooftop garden, finally completed after 2 redesigns that incorporated extensive community input and a participatory design process that took twice as long but created a space people actually wanted to use. Children played among vegetables they'd helped plant, while their parents. The building had become exactly what her imagined 80-year-old self had envisioned. Not just architecture, but social infrastructure that strengthened the entire neighborhood by creating spaces where people could pursue their own goals rather than conform to predetermined programs. David joined her on the rooftop, carefully supporting Eleanor, who now required assistance walking but remained mentally sharp at 77. The longitudinal study results came back, he announced with the excitement of someone who discovered that their life's work actually worked. "People who complete our protocol show sustained improvements in life satisfaction, relationship quality, and career fulfillment that persist for at least 5 years. More importantly, they report accessing ongoing internal wisdom rather than depending on external guidance. Any regrets about learning the truth behind the original letters? Eleanor asked Marigold as they watched the community garden's evening shift. Adults and children working together to tend plants that would feed families throughout the neighborhood. None, Marigold replied without hesitation. The mechanism was less important than the message. You gave us permission to access wisdom that was already inside us, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. The magic wasn't in the letters, it was in finally learning to listen to ourselves. As the sun set over the Pacific, painting the community garden in golden light that made everything look like a Renaissance painting, Marigold pulled out her phone and began typing her monthly letter from her imagined 90-year-old self, a practice that had become both spiritual discipline and practical planning tool. Dearest Marigold at 48, she wrote, from your 90-year-old self, with infinite love and hard-won clarity, the most important thing you'll learn in the coming decades is that wisdom doesn't require mystical delivery systems or supernatural intervention. It just requires the courage to listen to what you already know and the commitment to act on that knowledge, even when it's inconvenient, unprofitable, or requires admitting you've been building the wrong life. Eleanor watched with satisfaction as both architects continued their monthly correspondence with their imagined future selves, a practice that had evolved from desperate experiment to sustainable lifestyle. The letters that started everything taught you the most important lesson, she observed. The wisdom you need already exists inside you. You just need to create the conditions for listening. 3 universal principles had crystallized from their journey that anyone could implement immediately. First, practice internal consultation. Regular correspondence with your imagined future self accesses wisdom that transcends current limitations. The brain's capacity for temporal simulation consistently reveals insights your present perspective cannot access. Write weekly letters from your 80-year-old self to your current self, asking for guidance on specific decisions you're facing. Second, apply the energy audit equation. Before committing to any opportunity, calculate whether it gives more energy than it takes. Energy-positive activities compound over time. Energy-negative activities create debt that eventually bankrupts even successful people. If something drains more energy than it provides, it's not sustainable regardless of external rewards. Third, build life architecture, not just career architecture. Evaluate every major decision by asking, will my 80-year-old self be proud of this choice? Let that future perspective guide present actions toward human flourishing rather than just professional achievement. Design your days like you're designing a building meant to last 80 years. As they prepared to leave the community center, David reflected on their transformation with the perspective that comes from building something meaningful rather than just impressive. You know what the real revelation was? Not that the letters were planted by Eleanor, but that we already knew everything we needed to change. We just needed permission to trust our own wisdom instead of external validation. Marigold nodded, understanding that their story would be told not in the buildings they'd designed, but in the permission they'd given others to access their own internal guidance. The Future Self Protocol had become more than a therapeutic technique. It was proof that the wisdom we seek already exists inside us, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. The letter that started everything remained framed on Marigold's desk, not as mystical artifact, but as reminder that transformation doesn't require supernatural intervention. It just requires the courage to listen to the voice that already knows what your life looks like when it's being lived instead of just managed. Sometimes the most profound changes begin not with dramatic revelation, but with a simple recognition. The blueprints for your extraordinary life already exist inside you. They're just waiting for permission to build. In the end, the question isn't whether the letters came from the future or from Eleanor's therapeutic genius. The question is whether you're ready to listen to the voice that's been trying to guide you home to the life you're meant to live. The voice that sounds exactly like yours, speaking from the wisdom of someone who chose love over productivity, presence over prestige, and building a life over